Good evening and welcome to another edition of A Conversation with John Conenna. Tonight, we are honored to have on Heidi Vanlier, the daughter of the one and only Stormin Norman Vanlier of the Chicago Bulls. Heidi, this is really a great surprise that when you answered to me and said that you would do this, because for me, Norm was that guy that was really special to me growing up. I was 10 years old when Norm got drafted originally by the Chicago Bulls, and then the Chicago Bulls made a trade with the Cincinnati Royals at that time, and then we're fortunate to get him back. But to start off with you, what's going on with you, young lady, and how are things in LA?
Oh, I don't feel so young, so that's nice.
Yeah.
I live in LA, so does my sister, my mother. I work in television. I make reality TV. I produce reality TV. I tell people that I'm ruining America 1 hour at a time. But I've made shows like Rehab with Dr. Drew and Couples Therapy and Bad Girls Club and Wife Swap and stuff like that. And, I think probably growing up a little bit around my dad's TV work helped kind of push me in that direction. So that's where I ended up.
You know what? And I'm going to feed off that. He was such a great analyst. And at the end, you're going to love two things that I think you're going to remember about him that I remembered about him. He was a great analyst because of the fact he told it like it was. He was not going to mince words, Vanlier.
No.
The way he played is the way he spoke. And that's what I loved about Norman.
It is very, very.
In the off season, did you guys was it Minneapolis you were telling me we had a brief conversation, or was it LA where you guys say after the Bulls season, where would you guys live?
Well, so we lived in Seattle. When my parents met, we were moving from Minneapolis to Seattle. And then he moved to Seattle with us. That was probably in 75, 76. And then they got married in 80. We were living in Seattle then. And then in 85, we all moved to Los Angeles.
Oh, wow. Wow. Because he mentioned Los Angeles a lot, like even in interviews and everything, he would tell people. So it was basically the comfort zone for the family, correct?
Yeah. I mean, as much as Chicago is kind of our home in a lot of ways, I still miss Chicago terribly. It's just not the same town without my father anymore, unfortunately. But
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But we spent so much time in Chicago. Just, my dad was broadcasting for 30 years for them.
Wow,
So,
for sure.
and with the Score, and, he did a lot of TV, did Sports Channel, and he did Fox Sports. And some of that was with Steve Cashel. And so, he would be in Chicago for games and he would come back to LA when he could. But, those guys travel all the time. So they're just used to doing that.
After his basketball career, because that's where I'll pick it up with you in this sense. Was he passionate about announcing? Because like I said here at the opening, he did it so well in the way of the analyzation, because the man knew the game.
Yeah.
Could you see he was passionate about it?
I know he loved doing it. I don't know if he was necessarily so passionate about the game in the same way that he was when he was playing, but I think he found like a new kind of fun in broadcasting, and doing commentary and stuff like that. And, when he was on the sidelines and he was, doing pieces from halftime and all of that, he loved that because you get to go to the games and see everybody and people he'd known for years. And, the United Center was all the people who had moved from the Chicago Stadium. So he knew everybody who worked at the United Center. So just being there, I think, was really important to him. But I think the passion was different. I think it shifted. I think it shifted from sort of the fun of the game to the fun of being on TV and sort of being like a crazy kind of goofball personality.
He had that. Yeah. He made you almost, if you were the director or producer of Comcast Sports, you didn't know what was going to come out of his mouth. But at the end of the day, I thought he was still pretty good. But I mean, you were like, okay, especially if the Bulls were down and we had to watch him at the halftime. I was like, oh my God, what's Vanlier going to say now?
Oh.
Do
Yeah.
you know how the two met? How your mom and Norman met?
Yes, they met on a flight from Chicago to Seattle. My mother was just buying a house in Seattle. She was planning on moving, and she was on a flight with the Bulls, but she met my dad on the flight, and she didn't know, she knew he was associated with the team somehow, but she didn't really know how because he was smaller than everybody.
Yeah,
So
six
she
one is small. I wish I was 6'1". I'm 5'9", you know.
well, exactly. But you know, in basketball
Right.
terms, that's
Yeah.
incredibly small. And so she thought, she worried when right when she met him, she kind of worried that either he was a really bad player because he was so small, or he was somehow in the team's management somehow. She had really had no idea, but she met him, and they talked through the entire flight. And my dad used to tell it that he stood up at the end of the flight and just looked at her and said, "I need to see you again."
Oh,
And they
wow.
exchanged numbers, and it was a like super cute romance they had. I mean, I always love that story because I
Were
know
they
my dad.
sitting right by each other, or was she in another role?
My mom was a flight attendant.
Oh, she was the flight attendant.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I missed that at the beginning. So yeah, yeah. So yeah, he probably was staring her down the whole time.
Well, and it was like that era. I mean, my mom was part of the third ever class action suit against sexual harassment and
Yeah.
sexual discrimination, which was against Northwest Airlines. So it was the era when the flight attendants all had to have like headshots, basically. So you can imagine my mother was fairly attractive
Oh yeah, for sure.
for a flight attendant in 19 whatever 79, or God, it was way before that, 1975 even. But I think that that story really stands out to me because my dad, in a lot of ways, was very shy. I know this sounds crazy, but my dad was very shy in some ways. And one of those ways I know was asking my mother out because it just wasn't kind of in his nature. I think people approached him. And so the idea of him sort of being proactive and, you know, trying to get somebody's phone number sounds really cute to me because it does not sound like my father at all.
Right, right. But I could see that about him, not even knowing him. I could see that part of him. You know, was she smitten by him in that first? Did she
Oh,
ever bring
yeah.
that up?
Pretty quickly she was like, who is this? And I think she figured out that he was a player after after they landed. And then he invited her to a game. She went to the game and she was shocked to find out that he was excuse me,
Right,
a player.
right, 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 right.
I think that was against the Supersonics. And I think she was sort of stunned also to see that he was talented, because who would have thought this shorter guy was had the
Right,
ability
right.
he had,
So,
right?
and I know we're talking about Norm, but I have to tell you, and I got to make this comparison. And a lot of my friends think I'm crazy when I make this comparison because, like I says, I started watching the Bulls in '70. I was born in '60, and he had this walk about him. He had this like, you know, for the 6'1" guy, he had this like an arrogance about him. He had a walk. You know, it's like when Michael Jordan came out of the locker room in the mid '80s to when they were winning the championship. I felt like teams got intimidated by Jordan's appearance. You know, you were almost hoping, God, is he sick tonight? Because we don't want to play against Jordan. But your dad, you know, was this type of guy. He just had this way like almost like a street fighter, like, you know, come on, let's get it on. You know, he
Yeah,
was not that type who was going to back away from a challenge. So I was wondering if your mom loved his personality just from that get go.
I think his on-court personality was very different from his, you know, regular IRL personality. But he, you know, he would talk about like jump ball was like the first day of prison. Like you're trying to really screw somebody up off the jump ball. I think also he thought that he couldn't always make a jump ball, so he would come down hard on somebody. Um, but I think a lot of my dad's sort of playing style really was only on the court. Like you didn't necessarily see that when he wasn't in kind of game mode. But he definitely had like, you know, I remember my dad telling me about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's book and talking about having to go play Van Leer and that he was going to get beaten up the entire night. And I knew that was kind of the fear everybody had of him when they had to go to Chicago and play him, is that he, he could really, he
Yeah,
could
you
play.
were not going to come out of there, feeling like you had a tuxedo on. There was no way. But I have to tell you, you bring up Kareem Abdul-Jabbar because at the time when Dad was in the league, his name was Lou Alcindor, and then of
Yeah.
course he changed the religion.
Yeah.
But the game that I will never forget, and I saw it, it was one of the first broadcasts that was on a technical network.
Oh,
Uh,
right.
they were down to the Lakers 2-0 and they had to come back to the Chicago Stadium. And there was no 3-point line then. Dad came out
Right.
and hit three 2-pointers
Yeah.
at the time to give us a 6-0 lead. And the ball kind of bounced away and it bounced over to him back again. The Lakers had called a timeout. And at that time, the Lakers center was Wilt Chamberlain, who was the great Wilt Chamberlain, who was
Right.
7'2", and your dad's
Yep.
looking up at him 10 inches taller.
Right.
And he picks up the ball, and the stadium is louder than loud. And all of a sudden, the broadcast, you could hear it. He took the ball and he threw it to Chamberlain, and he goes and he had that walk, and he says,
Yeah.
"We're going to get it on tonight, Wilt." And here, you're looking at a guy larger than life, and it was one of the greatest games ever that people over. But that was his personality. But you're saying to me that when he was at home with you, like say in the later 70s, how was
Yeah.
was he
I think he did go through some, I used to call it post-achievement stress disorder, because I felt like those first couple years after he quit playing, I mean, he quit before he really wanted to quit because he was injured, really.
he got
And
injured in Milwaukee, I think.
yeah, well, he got injured before Milwaukee, I think, but you should look this up and tell me for
Okay.
what's true, John. But I thought he got injured before Milwaukee. He moved to Milwaukee and he just didn't feel like he was playing at his top game. And I think it depressed him. And there was sort of an era where he was kind of trying to find himself after that. I know he wanted to broadcast really badly, but like the jobs weren't just coming as quickly as he wanted. And there were a few years where he was really struggling with kind of like the post achievement of it. I mean, he would say things like the roar of the crowd was missing.
Sure.
I think you just miss that becomes its own kind of addiction in a way, is this sort of need to have this kind of 30,000 people's approval at a moment's
Right.
notice. And that's something that he had for so much of his life. And then for that to just be gone probably was a little traumatic. But he definitely went through, his bad days that couple years after he quit playing. And then he started picking up coaching gigs. He started coaching at Compton College first. And then he ended up coaching in Worcester, Mass.
Worcester
And
for the Counts, right? I think the Worcester
I
Counts.
think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a short-lived era. So and I didn't really even go out there to sort of see what was going on. I was kind of like in my 20s already at this point and kind of
Right.
moving on with it. But and then he coached the Rockford Lightning for the CBA.
Yes. I
And
forgot about that one. That's a good one you brought up. Yeah.
yeah. And then the broadcasting gigs started coming faster and more frequently. And I think he was so excited to finally have this like broadcasting career that he'd been kind of aiming for after he quit playing.
Was he one for bringing, I mean, I know, was he one for bringing things home, like the broadcast, or oh my god, the Bulls really were horrible tonight, or oh god, this guy, what is he even doing on the team? Was he that type of guy, or would he leave it at the
No,
studio, leave it at the arena?
he really did leave it at the studio. He didn't even really talk about it much with us. Like with his kids, he didn't really talk about it that much.
Right.
We would see him watching games. We would see him sort of like, studying for something that was coming up. Like if he was doing like an NBC gig for like the finals or something, he would be kind of studying up before he went to shoot that. But most of the time, like we weren't even, I mean, this could sound really weird. We weren't even really aware of like him playing basketball when he was.
Wow.
And this is going to sound really strange,
Yeah.
but because my mom was a flight attendant, my mom was barely ever home. We had like a nanny who kind of lived with us most of the time, not like a Richie Rich kind of nanny scenario. She was basically a babysitter, but
Right. Watching over you guys.
What?
Watching over you guys,
Yeah,
basically. Yeah.
exactly. And so, and he and both my parents would be gone. So, like, my understanding of, having parents that worked was that my parents were mostly out of town. And so I don't know that I even really processed what my father was up to. I used to tell people that I didn't really even get what my father did until I was like 24 years old. And we used to get free cars from dealerships in Chicago who would like, be happy for my dad to drive the car around with the plates of their dealership on it. And then he would go do appearances at
Wow.
those car dealerships. And we got a lot of really lovely cars. I mean, I had a Mercedes and a BMW at one point just from this sort of like deal that he had. And
Well, yeah,
and
sure.
they were nothing but lovely to us. But I drove a car back. This was probably in 1995, I'm going to say, or 1994.
During those
But
bull runs.
yeah, during the Jordan era. And I drove across the country and I stopped in St. Louis for dinner. And there was a WGN or Comcast or something my dad was doing was on TV in St. Louis for some big Jordan game. And I saw my dad on TV in like a sports bar. I was like, what is this? Like it
Right.
totally freaked me out because I hadn't really been to Chicago much that since like high school, I guess, at that point. Like so for a few years I didn't really go. And then I saw him on TV and I was like, this is so strange. I guess I just didn't think
You
about
kind
it.
of like a surreal thing, like what's going on here? Yeah.
It was so surreal. And then as we drove into Chicago and we started to realize like the whole town was centered around basketball in that era, that the Jordan era was such a phenomenal era for the Bulls and for the city. I mean, that city was a different town during the Jordan era. And, we drove into Chicago and I was going to go hang out with him. I ended up just moving there and making a movie there and like
Wow.
starting a film career just from driving this car across the country because I was like, what? This town is amazing right now. Like I should be making a movie here. I should
You're
be
right.
writing while I'm here. And I ended up staying for almost a couple of years just working on this film and writing and, trying to sort of get my young career off the ground. But it was a very bizarre realization because I also didn't really realize that people still understood who he was in the world.
Yeah,
And
sure.
I would go places with him and it was like, you know, people screaming at him out of buses and cabs and things. And I
You're
was
like,
just
hey, Norman or Stormin, yeah. Heidi, how was I want to go back to him, of course, but how was he about your career with the acting and all that? How was he about it?
he he was amazing. He for my first film called Shy Girl, like Chicago, that ended up winning like a big award at this festival called the Slamdance Film Festival.
Okay.
Um, my dad basically would go around Chicago with me and talk people into giving me stuff for free for the movie.
Wow.
And I basically made like a $2 million movie for $50,000 because my dad just walked around and pulled favors literally everywhere
Sure,
for me.
sure, sure. But
Yeah.
that's how he was. He was such a motivated man. That's what how I looked into Norm Van Leer. He was such a motivated man. That's something, I mean, just when I go to look at his career, and I mean, I don't know what more you look at his career. I was talking to a gentleman the other day who was the Bulls announcer. I interviewed him. His name is Chuck Swirsky. He does the
Okay.
radio, and he did work with Norm for a little bit. And we have kind of the Bulls, of course, are on the downside again. Um, and we talked about five guys, and it wasn't even the Jordan era. We talked about five guys. I says Chet Walker, Bob
Uh,
Love, Tom Borwinkle, Jerry Sloan, and Norm Van Leer. I just
yeah.
looked up your dad's stats today. Of course, I remember him playing from 71 to 78. This man played 5 seasons in a row, 80 games, 40 on the road, 40 at the Chicago Stadium, 80 games. I'm sure he had to have had ankle pain. I'm sure he had to have had colds. I'm sure he had to have this. They probably had COVID then and they didn't know it. But does he talk about, he probably was playing with COVID in the 70s, and this man doesn't
That's
miss a
what it
game,
was.
you
Yeah,
know.
that's what it
So
was.
my question is this: does he bring up the fact of did he ever say, like when he was doing the analyzations, the athlete of when he was playing with those players and how he
Oh
played.
yeah. I mean, it was I think he talked a lot about it being a different game, and that it was far more violent when he was playing.
Oh yeah.
But his body was really screwed up. He had pins in his knee or hip, or I don't know. He had knee issues and hip issues like you wouldn't believe. All his fingers had been broken at one point or another.
Oh sure.
He, dislocated everything you can imagine. And I think he had like my mom still talks about this because my mom finds it so interesting. She's interested in like, you know, metaphysics and sort of natural healing and things like that. And so my mom always talked about the fact that my dad was capable of shutting pain off and continuing to play, which he did every
Yeah.
time he was injured and had broken fingers. He would just continue games. And obviously, a lot of them do this. Obviously, that's not just my dad, but he was the walking wounded after every game. And I think, I don't know if you've read like the Reader article my dad did with Ben Jarofsky. I don't know if you ever saw that. It's from
Yes,
years.
and I mentioned when we had talked a month or so ago. I think had Jurowski approached you too for an interview at that time? I can't
Mm,
remember. Somebody had approached you for an interview or something.
he might have. I don't remember. I mean, my
Yeah,
life is so chaotic.
but I did not read. Go ahead. I didn't want to
He
interrupt
might
you.
have. I just forgot. I
Yeah,
mean, I'll have to
I'm glad
email
you
him.
didn't forget about me.
Yeah, love him. I love him. But yeah, my life is so chaotic. That's highly likely, and that I just didn't do it, and now I'm going to feel terrible, and have to send him an email. But
No, but you were
uh,
saying something about the
well, he did that big article with him for the Reader, and I think that's who did it, right? Isn't he the one who did?
Jurowski.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
you are correct.
I hope I'm right, and I feel terrible if I'm wrong, Ben. But whatever, I'll apologize later. But
We'll edit it out.
yeah, exactly. Editing, yay.
Don't worry. Don't worry.
But in that article, he talked about, when he was playing, he started taking Quaaludes right after every game, and he was, really struggling physically to live um, between games. And I think that, he was an addict, and he talked about this very publicly, and his drug use really did stem, I think, from the pain that he was in from
Sure.
playing, not
Sure.
really ever getting a chance to kind of recover, or really like, there, as much as there's an off season, I don't know that the off season is enough for people to really fully heal. It's a really rough game, and in that era it was even rougher. So
Exactly. I mean, that's a great point by you because what I just mentioned, you just tied in beautifully. I mean, this man was playing 80 games. We turn on a television, we grab a popcorn, and we're like, oh, yeah, look at this. Vanlier just missed the shot. Oh, look at this. Vanlier did this. You don't know. You're getting off a plane. You're playing a game.
oh
You're
yeah.
listening to crowd. And then you're grinding it out, like Jabbar said about him. So yeah, I can imagine they didn't. The great Henry Aaron, the baseball player, said
Hmm.
he did take also like an amphetamine, not to enhance his play, but to recuperate from pain. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I can imagine through all that. Yeah, he had a lot of
Yeah.
withdrawal with it. Heidi,
What?
did he have a lot of withdrawal from it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that he ever fully quit taking things. I think he sort of needed it for the majority of his life. But he was a functioning addict. He still got up at 3 a.m. and did the Score
All
morning
right.
drive. I don't know how the hell he did that, but he did that for years and years and years.
Sure.
And he had to be completely, he did end up being a diabetic. And I think that sort of kind of came into the fore while he was on the air. So it only kind of crept in at times like that when he was like struggling medically.
Sure.
But he did talk about it. He was very open about it. He did go to Betty Ford. He was very, very open about that. Um, I just don't know that it ever really, I don't know. I mean, I worked on rehab with Dr. Drew. I don't know if people ever really get clean and sober like people want them to,
Sure.
realistic,
Sure. And
you know.
after his career, he had to
Mm.
do this, like you said, you brought up another good point here tonight. Yeah, he had to do this analyzation and interview and being an analyst. you have to prepare. It's not like you go into the studio with the suit on and the slick blazer, and all of a sudden, hi, I'm Norm Van Leer, and you're going to start talking. You have to know who's on the team of the Boston Celtics, let alone the Chicago Bulls.
Yes. And I think he just had a brain for that kind of stuff. He could
Oh,
really
yeah.
hold information like nobody's business, which, I feel like all sports fans can really do that, where you're like, what? How did you remember that
Yeah, how
person's
do you
name?
remember that?
Or
Yeah.
what?
I said, like, how did you remember that? Right, right.
Yeah,
You know.
exactly. And you're like, what? How'd you know that? But I do remember, and Steve Cashel will probably confirm this, or deny it, I'm not sure. But I do remember going to the studio with him, and he wouldn't be watching the game for periods of time. And I'd be like, don't you need to like pay attention to the game? And he was like, no, I already know what happens in this game. And I would be like, what do you
Wow.
mean? But and he basically, and he would kind of this is in the late stages, by the way. But I think at some point it had become by rote to some degree. Like he felt like all the games kind of ended up being similar in some way, and he could kind
Sure.
of just call a game based on what he heard in the other room.
Yeah, exactly. He can
And
remember, yeah, he can
yeah,
feed off
but
that.
it is also, though, it's the, extreme amounts of studying the game for so many years. Like, I think it does become more simplified to them, right?
Oh, sure, sure. And the word you used, he knew what was going to happen. I mean, he just the way he played, he was a great student of the game. You know,
Yeah.
there's a Bulls team that always stayed is in my heart. That the Jordan era was great. Don't get me wrong. I mean, they of course had Jordan, Pippen, a little bit of a surrounding cast than what Norm had.
Well, he
But
had
there was
Bob, Chet, and Jerry. I mean, those were his dearest friends, too.
dearest friends, and I've told people, which we'll get to toward the end, if there's two guys I want on the rafters, I know Bob Love and Sloan are up there. Should be Van Leer and should be Chet Walker. But I got to tell you, 1974-75 for me, I was in eighth grade, and they were up 3-2 on the Golden State Warriors.
Oh, I know this era well. Yeah.
And Mother's Day, they had a chance to close out the Warriors at the stadium, and they were going to play then the Washington Bullets for the World Championship. And of course, the Golden
Goals.
State Warriors with Rick Barry wound up winning Game 6. And then in Game 7, they went to Golden State, had a 10-point lead at halftime. The Bulls blew it and lost the game. It was never the same after that, because then that team got dismantled.
Yeah.
And Norm, I think, was one of the last ones left.
Yeah.
Sloan had retired. Walker was a little bit up in age, but it was Heidi. And the reason why I brought that up, it was the one that got away. It's still the
Yeah.
one that's still my favorite team in Chicago, the
Yeah.
74-75 team. Did he ever mention it? That
Uh,
that band of
uh,
guys, could they have won a
yeah.
championship?
What'd you say
The
about the
question
champion?
is, during that 71-78 run when he was with the Bulls, did he say that band of guys came ever so close?
Yes. So he didn't like talking about that game, but everybody else would bring it up. Whenever we went anywhere in Chicago, somebody would bring it up. And I would be like, what is this game? What is this
Yeah.
game? I'd ask him, he'd be like, I don't want to talk about this. Like he would just kind of avoid it. I happened to see an ESPN, like when ESPN Classic started, whatever that was in the early 90s or
Yes.
maybe 90s or whatever. My ex-husband was watching TV and he was just flipping around and he started screaming for me to come upstairs. And I came upstairs. He's like, I think this is your dad's game. I think this is that game.
Yeah. That was the
And
game.
and it was the second half because they didn't play the first half on TV in that era. It was the second half of the game. And a lot of things I was probably like 21 when I saw this. A
Wow.
lot of things became really weirdly clear to me about my upbringing from watching this game, because I hadn't really seen my dad play as an adult. So I had no real, and ESPN Classics just started. So like there were
Right.
no like games, there was no internet yet. Like there was no way of just really like looking up and seeing him play. And so this was really the first time I really got to watch what he was like on the court. And I realized two things. One, he was even better than I had kind of anticipated. And I knew that this game was incredibly important to him. And at one point, he like clears like Brent Musburger's
Table
table. Yeah, of
where the
like Coca.
coffees and everything were. Yeah.
Yeah, and he gets down on the ground when he realizes there's no way to win the game anymore. And he's like on the ground. You can see he's like trying not to cry. Like it's such an emotional game in so many ways. So already that was just like, what is this? And then the other part was that I realized that the way my dad parented was, and he was like our primary parent. He really took care
Right.
of us. Even my mom did so much because my mom was flying all the time. So when it was the off season, my dad was like a house husband. Like he went to PTA, he, drove us to school every morning. Like he made sure we did our homework. He cooked for us every night. Like he was really he was, Mr. Mom.
Sure.
And so to see that, I realized that we weren't really parented, we were coached. And that's because those were my dad's father figures. All his coaches were his
Sure.
father figures. And I think, for any kid who grows up in sports, I think the coaches become such a vital part of their upbringing. But my dad really learned how to be inspirational, motivational. Um, and, a lot of tough love came out of, his being brought up by coaches. And then he kind of instilled that in us. I mean, I remember, when I was just talking to him about my career and being a writer in LA, and it was, not pro woman very much in the 90s when I was kind of starting out. And my dad would be like, so what? So what? Just go
Right.
do it. Just so what? And I would say, like, well, no, they don't really let girls do this yet. And it's really difficult. He's like, so what? Does not matter. Just don't even talk about it. Just go do it.
Really.
And that was always his attitude about everything was, and it's funny because it really did affect me. My dad was a feminist in sort of the most interesting way, which is that he was like, we're not going to look at that. We're going to just do it anyway.
He was
And
fearless. He was fearless.
he was fearless and he wanted us to be fearless and he taught us to be fearless. Um, I didn't know that that's what had happened though until I saw this game and it kind of
Yeah.
all crystallized and I really sort of got it in a way that I didn't get my upbringing before I'd seen that game. But that game was a game everybody wherever we went.
Oh, talk to me. Heidi and I in 1969, the Chicago Cubs had a chance to win. They failed. And then there was
Right.
the 1971 Blackhawks, which I'm more of a hockey guy than I was a basketball. They had a chance to win in Chicago Stadium and lost. And then, of course, that 1975 game on Mother's Day, where if they would have closed out the Warriors, they would have played the Bullets and they would have destroyed the Bullets in a 7-game series. He laid it all on the line that day. And
Really,
for me, it was just like, wow, it just was. He knew that if they went back to Golden State, they were gonna, he just knew it
yeah,
was gonna be a tougher task. But
absolutely. It
I,
was. He knew it was over when he was on the ground. He was
oh,
like,
sure, sure. Yeah, but
he,
it's
he,
funny you gave me goosebumps then because I didn't think you would know about that, and now you're
oh,
telling me that yeah, it's still talked about here in Chicago. Well,
oh
listen,
yeah.
I here I thought, okay, you weren't gonna know nothing and you knew so much, but
Well, I mean, I only know my father's stories. That's what's interesting is my understanding of my dad's playing days are only from stories that my father told me. It's or for that, people in Chicago told me, not from my own experience. And that's what I sort of meant. It's like I don't even have a real understanding of basketball in the way that fans do. I have an understanding of basketball from behind the scenes and from a PR perspective more than I do from
sure,
playing or understanding.
yeah. Has it ever
You know.
come up about in one of my main campaigns, because I did a biography on him 2 years ago that I sent to you a little bio about him. Has it ever come up from the Chicago Bulls that over the years maybe they were thinking about putting number 2 in the rafter for the retiring that number?
Not that I've heard. Uh, I mean, I think it would be amazing. Isn't there a kid playing with that number now? Ball? Isn't Ball
Yeah,
playing with
and
that?
he's hurt right now, so yeah, he's out right now. But yeah, 2 is still a number that can be worn. But I
Yeah.
just feel like who's ever up there right now, he deserves his just due. I always tell people that I feel that he should be in the rafter, and
Yeah. I
it
mean,
was
I mean that's something I've posted about on my Facebook frequently because it does sort of break my heart that he's not up there, and I know it broke his heart to some degree.
sure,
Um, but I also know, he was. It's hard to say why that went down the way it went down and why they kind of, have overlooked him a little bit. I mean, they didn't totally overlook him. He worked for them for years. Like, it's not
I
like he
got
wasn't
you.
the Bulls. But I do think that his outspoken nature caused some problems for him.
Sure.
And, that's, you hope things like that don't happen. My dad was just being honest about what he felt about the team or what he felt about management and stuff like that. But I think that really did create some waves that maybe made it more difficult for his jersey to be up there.
Up there. Well, you know what? I mean, we still talk about it. Matter of fact, there's a great sports announcer here in Chicago named Kenny McReynolds who loved Dad.
Oh, sounds really familiar.
Yeah, he has a sports show here in Chicago. We still talk about that. We are on this mission to get this #2 in the rafter. But I got to tell you, just looking at this, and I know your time is valuable. This was great tonight. But I have to tell you, here's a man who was a 5-time the NBA defensive. He was on 4 All-Star teams. His number is at St. Francis. Of course, he's in the Hall of Fame there at his college. Being a number 3 round draft pick. I mean, what else can you say about him? And he was really that heart and soul from 71 to 78. I'm going to leave you with this tonight. There were 2 things that he left an impression on me besides him being Norm Vanlier. There were 2 things, especially at every halftime when he was an analyst. He had the greatest line when a guy was maybe running around, looked like he was doing things, but he really wasn't on the court. His favorite line was, "Don't confuse activity with productivity." That was his favorite. And when the Bulls were down and they had to show something, his famous word with that accent of his, he'd go, "Intensity, intensity. We need intensity." And that word was your father, Norman Vanlier.
Yeah.
Heidi,
Yeah.
I really, truly want to thank you for coming on tonight. And hopefully we can meet down the road. This was great to kind of reminisce of my Chicago. I'm going to say it for the first time, and I'm 63 years old. Probably my Chicago. I liked him more than Jordan, no doubt about it.
Wow.
And I mean, okay, Jordan was Jordan, but if Norm was practicing against Jordan, he'd give Jordan fits.
I'm sure they would have fun. He liked Jordan a lot, so I'm sure they would have had fun. It's funny because most people, when I run into them in Chicago, and I'll just sort of leave you with this, people will just encounter me in Chicago and say, "I had drinks with your dad." And it got to the point where anybody would come up to me and I'd be like, "You had drinks with my dad?" And they'd be like, "Yeah, how'd you know?" But when I'm in Chicago, John, you and I should have drinks.
Without a doubt. You've got to, we've been keeping in touch. As soon as you come into town, you got to let me know.
For sure. That's great.
And I've never met your mom, and I think you have another sister. The best. And I'm going to get this out to you, and you're going to love this. Again, this warmed my heart because finally I had a chance to talk to Norm Vanlier through the eyes of his daughter.
I'm so glad I could help. I don't know if this is really information your listeners want, but I hope so.
It was great. It was great. All right, Heidi. I appreciate it, and you have a great week and a good night.
You too. Thank you so much. I'm sorry my light caved on me in the middle of that.
No, it's good. It's good. Thanks, Heidi. Good night.
Talk to you later.